In May of 1945, the destroyed streets of Berlin were filled with female bodies executed in cold blood. They were not soldiers. They were civilian women, nurses, workers, teenagers. Some had been armed in the final defense of the Reich. Others were simply trying to hide. But all were marked as targets. In the midst of the Soviet occupation, the city became a scene of mass rapes, systematic torture, and summary executions. Without law or control, thousands of women were hunted, selected, abused, and eliminated. Some were shot for carrying a rifle. Others died after days of continuous sexual assaults. In hospitals, shelters, convents, and streets, the horror repeated without pause. What turned the victory over Nazism into a nightmare for German women? And why were these crimes silenced in history? Berlin in flames, the final hell of the Third Reich. April of 1945. Berlin, once the imposing capital of the Nazi Empire, had become a graveyard of smoking ruins. The grand avenues designed for military parades were now corridors of fire and shrapnel. The city, epicenter of Nazi power for 12 years, was facing its final moment. The Red Army's Berlin operation began on April 16th, when 3 Soviet fronts converged on the German capital from the Oder River. Zhukov's First Belarusian Front from the east, Konev's First Ukrainian Front from the southeast, and Rokossovsky's Second Belarusian Front from the north. This force of more than 2.5 million soldiers, 6,250 tanks, and 41,600 artillery pieces was the final hammer to fall upon Nazism. Stalin had ordered Berlin to be taken before the Western Allies, ensuring that it would be the red flag flying over the city's ruins. It was more than a military goal. It symbolized revenge for the 27 million Soviets killed after the German invasion. The defense of the capital, commanded by General Helmuth Weidling, could barely offer resistance. Of the 800,000 nominal defenders, most were inexperienced recruits, teenagers from the Hitler Youth, elderly members of the Volkssturm, and forced foreign laborers. Only around 45,000 were experienced regular soldiers, primarily SS, who knew they would not be shown mercy. The city became an improvised fortress with barricades made of rubble, overturned trams, and furniture. Some subway stations were deliberately flooded to hinder Soviet advance, sacrificing hundreds of civilians. Berliners, who had endured years of Allied bombings, now faced the horror of urban combat. The noise was deafening: shellfire, collapsing buildings, screams of the wounded, and tanks rolling through narrow streets. Daily life was a struggle for survival. Official rations barely reached 1,000 calories per day. Water had to be collected from public pumps. Electricity was intermittent, and gas nearly non-existent. Most survived on potatoes, turnips, and black bread, occasionally supplemented with horse meat or pets. In black markets, a cigarette could be traded for a small loaf of bread. The psychological state of the population oscillated between terror and hopelessness. Goebbels' propaganda messages now seemed a cruel mockery. A slogan on the walls proclaimed, "Every German will defend his capital with his life." But most no longer believed in victory. They only wanted to survive. The fear was justified. Nazi propaganda had portrayed the Soviets as Asian barbarians thirsty for German blood, using the same dehumanizing language the Nazis had used against the Russians. Stories of atrocities in East Prussia and Silesia circulated, where thousands of women had been raped. Many families contemplated collective suicide as an alternative to falling into Soviet hands. Meanwhile, in the Chancellery bunker, Hitler was directing a phantom war. His orders did not correspond with reality. He demanded counterattacks with non-existent divisions and condemned generals for cowardice when they reported honestly. Physically diminished by Parkinson's and mentally unstable, he alternated between rage and apathy. On April 30th, Hitler committed suicide alongside Eva Braun, whom he had married a day earlier. Their bodies were burned in the Chancellery gardens while the fighting raged just meters away. The next day, Goebbels followed his example after poisoning his 6 children with cyanide. On May 2nd, General Weidling formally ordered the surrender. The German troops laid down their arms. Thousands attempted to break through the Soviet encirclement to surrender to the Western Allies, aware that their chances of survival would be greater. When the red flag was raised over the Reichstag, more than 100,000 German defenders had died, and another 125,000 were prisoners. But surrender did not mean peace. Without any authority structures, and with Soviet soldiers drunk on victory and alcohol, Berlin became a no-man's land. The streets were filled with unburied corpses and civilians in shock searching for water, food, or shelter. For German women, the real horror was only beginning. This chapter of the war, far from being an epilogue, would be for them the darkest trial, a nightmare where their bodies became the final battlefield of a conflict that had consumed the world for 6 years. The Red Storm, Soviet revenge against German women. The violence unleashed upon German women was not a spontaneous or random phenomenon, but the result of a lethal convergence of planned revenge, war propaganda, moral collapse, and a military culture that tacitly legitimized sexual violence as war booty. It all began with Operation Barbarossa in June of 1941, when Hitler broke the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and invaded the Soviet Union. It was not a conventional military campaign, but a war of systematic extermination conceived under Nazi racial ideology. The general plan for the East envisioned the elimination or enslavement of the Slavic population to create living space, Lebensraum, for German settlers. This apocalyptic vision materialized in directives that ordered the execution of political commissars, partisans, and Jews without distinction between combatants and civilians. The German troops left behind an unprecedented trail of destruction. Entire villages were razed, their inhabitants executed or deported as slave labor. The scorched earth policy applied during the German retreat magnified the suffering. Fields were burned, livestock slaughtered, wells poisoned, and infrastructure destroyed. Soviet suffering was immeasurable. 27 million citizens lost their lives, including 8.7 million soldiers and over 18 million civilians. Leningrad endured a 900-day siege during which 800,000 people died from hunger, cold, or bombings. In Stalingrad, house-to-house combat left 900,000 soldiers dead. At Babi Yar, near Kiev, special German squads executed 33,000 Soviet Jews in just 2 days. Sexual violence was also part of this invasion. Historical studies have documented systematic rapes by German troops, especially in Ukraine and Belarus. Though less organized than the Holocaust, these assaults were widespread and often ended with the murder of the victims. The dehumanization of Slavs made many soldiers view these actions not as crimes but as justifiable acts against an inferior race. When Soviet troops finally crossed into German territory in 1945, they did so carrying not only weapons, but a near-biblical sense of retribution. Many soldiers had seen their homes destroyed and their families massacred. Some carried photographs of their dead loved ones, vowing to avenge them. Soviet propaganda, far from tempering these impulses, deliberately fueled them. Writer Ilya Ehrenberg published inflammatory articles with phrases such as, "If you haven't killed at least one German today, you've wasted the day. If you've killed one German, kill another. Nothing gives us more joy than German corpses." These texts, distributed in millions of pamphlets, turned all Germans into legitimate targets. Although in January of 1945 Stalin issued orders to treat the German civilian population properly, the psychological damage had already been done. Millions of soldiers had internalized the idea that every German deserved punishment. The distinction between enemy army and civilian population had been completely blurred. The Soviet soldiers who entered Berlin were mostly young peasants with limited education. Many had never left their villages before the war. For them, 4 years of conflict had normalized extreme violence. Constant exposure to death and brutality had eroded their moral restraints. Several factors exacerbated this desensitization. The soldiers operated under an extremely harsh disciplinary regime. Orders number 270 and number 227, not one step back, stated that surrender or withdrawal without orders amounted to treason, punishable by summary execution. Thousands of Soviet soldiers were shot by their own officers for minor infractions. This brutal environment normalized violence as a method of control. A key factor added to this: alcohol. The wine cellars and distilleries of Berlin provided massive quantities of liquor to troops who had never had access to such amounts. Officers often distributed vodka before battles and afterward as a reward. The result was a permanently intoxicated occupation force. In this explosive context, German women became symbols of the enemy and primary targets for revenge. They were not seen as innocent civilians, but as integral parts of the Nazi system. Mothers raising sons for the Wehrmacht, wives supporting soldiers who committed atrocities, workers in munitions factories. Sexual violence became an act of collective retribution, a way to humiliate not only the direct victims, but all of Germany through them. A lieutenant wrote to his family, "Berlin is our trophy, it's women too." Another soldier confessed, "We feel nothing for them, they're fascists. We showed mercy in Stalingrad and look what they did to us. There will be no mercy in Berlin." The Soviet High Command issued directives to control the behavior of the troops, such as Directive No. 006, which ordered discipline and respect for the civilian population. However, these orders were practically impossible to implement. The colossal size of the Red Army, with millions of men in enemy territory, made any effective supervision difficult. The confusion of urban combat further reduced officers' control. More importantly, there was tacit complicity at many levels of command. Numerous officers participated in the assaults or tolerated them as a reward for their men. Others simply looked the other way, considering them inevitable in wartime. General Sokolovsky, when informed of mass rapes, allegedly responded, "This always happens. We can't change human nature." A disturbing phenomenon was the involvement of some Soviet women in uniform. Some tried to protect German civilians, risking punishment for sympathizing with the enemy. Others remained silent or encouraged the assaults, convinced that historical justice was being served. A nurse later declared, "We hated everything German. When we saw what was happening, we thought, let them suffer like our women did." The violence did not discriminate by age or condition. 10-year-old girls, 80-year-old grandmothers, nuns, pregnant women, all were victims. It didn't matter whether a woman had supported the Nazi regime or had been one of its victims. Being German made her a target. Some victims were even Jews who had survived the Holocaust by hiding, only to face this new form of terror. The nature of the assaults reveals that it was not simply about sexual gratification, but about systematic domination and humiliation. Many women were raped repeatedly, sometimes by dozens of soldiers in front of their families or in public spaces. Some were physically marked as a visible reminder of their defeat. Others were kidnapped for days, kept as sex slaves in buildings occupied by Soviet units. Most tragic of all was the official silence that followed. Stalin had no interest in tarnishing the image of the heroic Red Army that had liberated Europe from fascism. Reports on these crimes were classified or destroyed. Soldiers were instructed not to speak about these aspects of the campaign. Decades later, when historians tried to document these crimes, they encountered closed archives, censored testimonies, and an official narrative that denied or minimized what had happened. This conspiracy of silence added another layer of trauma for the survivors. Not only had they been victimized, but now their suffering was being denied by official history. Human hunt in Berlin, when being a woman was a death sentence. In the early days of May 1945, when formal combat in Berlin had ceased, a terrifying dynamic settled over the city that survivors described as Die Jagd, the hunt. This was not disciplined military operations, but systematic predation in which women became prey. The persecution followed identifiable patterns, specific hours, and recurring methods that revealed its organized nature. The hunting hours were known to all Berlin women. They generally began at dusk when Soviet soldiers had finished their duties and consumed enough alcohol. Groups of 3 to 10 men would roam the streets, abandoned buildings, and air raid shelters where many civilians were hiding. Women learned to recognize the ominous signs: military boots on staircases, drunken laughter, the metallic sound of flashlights striking walls. A recurring pattern was the systematic search of underground shelters. These spaces, which had saved countless lives during bombings, became death traps. Soldiers entered with flashlights, pointed them at the terrified civilians' faces in the darkness, and selected the youngest women. Sometimes they used interpreters, but more often relied on gestures or basic phrases like Frau komm, woman come, one of the few German expressions many had learned specifically. Resistance was impossible. The few German men present, generally elderly, teenagers or wounded, who attempted to defend their families were executed on the spot. sometimes with bayonets to avoid wasting ammunition. One survivor recounted how her 68-year-old father, who tried to protect his 16-year-old daughter, was beaten unconscious and then repeatedly stabbed as the soldiers laughed. A cruel aspect of this dynamic was the visual selection. Soldiers illuminated the women, evaluated them like livestock, and chose those they found most attractive. The chosen were separated amid screams and struggles and taken to empty apartments, military vehicles, or alleyways. Some returned hours later, traumatized and physically destroyed. Others never returned. Their bodies were found days or weeks later, sometimes showing signs of extreme torture. To avoid being selected, women developed various camouflage strategies. Many tried to appear older or less attractive. They covered their faces with ash or mud, undid their hair, wore oversized elderly clothing, or wrapped themselves in dirty bandages to simulate illness. Some shaved their heads or applied charcoal to their teeth to simulate decay. Young mothers smeared themselves with baby feces. These tactics occasionally worked, but soldiers soon learned to see through the disguises. Others chose to hide in incredibly small spaces for days or even weeks. False ceilings behind wardrobes, in ventilation ducts, in basements sealed with rubble. One survivor recounted staying 3 days in a space barely 40 centimeters wide between the ceiling and a false roof, motionless even as she heard other women being attacked directly below. Another survived 2 weeks in a chimney flue, secretly fed by neighbors when soldiers were absent. Women also developed alert and communication systems. They established pipe-knocking codes to warn each other when soldiers approached. Others organized watch shifts with people posted at windows or rooftops. In Wilmersdorf, a group of neighbors devised a signaling system using sheets hung in specific windows to indicate safe routes to communal hiding spots. A devastating practice was the shifts, or convoys. Once captured, a woman was kept in a fixed location, an abandoned apartment, a looted store, a military depot, where shifts were organized to assault her over days. Medical testimonies documented cases of women raped by 30, 40 or more soldiers consecutively. Some died from internal bleeding or traumatic shock. Others were left so physically and mentally destroyed they never recovered. The violence was not limited to sexual assault. Many women were subjected to torture, mutilation, and execution, often for mere pleasure or as an extreme expression of revenge. A recurring pattern was the murder of victims who had resisted too much or were too injured to be used again. Methods varied: point-blank gunshots, strangulation, fatal blows with rifle butts. In districts such as Neukölln and Kreuzberg, the bodies of women were found showing signs of extreme torture, including genital mutilation, amputated breasts, and extracted internal organs. Dr. Franz Königshaus documented 187 women murdered with extreme sexual mutilations in the district of Moabit alone between May 1st and 15th, 1945. Armed women or those associated with the resistance faced a particularly cruel fate. During the final stages of the battle, following Hitler's policy of total defense, some women had joined Volkssturm units or worked as SS auxiliaries. Others simply kept weapons at home for protection. When captured with arms, they were not treated as regular combatants. They were classified as snipers or terrorists and summarily executed, often after being gang-raped. A Soviet soldier described an incident in Pankow. "We found 5 women with rifles. The oldest wasn't even 20. All wore Volkssturm armbands. The commander ordered them taken to the courtyard. I thought they'd be interrogated, but they were simply lined up against the wall and shot. Then the bodies were left there as a warning to other fascists." The scenes of these atrocities shared common characteristics: locations where victims were completely isolated and vulnerable. In a maternity clinic in Schöneberg, a group of soldiers attacked not only nurses but also patients who had just given birth, some still attached to IVs. Schools, often used as improvised shelters, were frequent targets. At the Leibniz school, at least 87 women and girls were assaulted in a single day when a Soviet artillery unit established its command post there. Particularly disturbing were the attacks on religious institutions. Several convents were invaded, and nuns were systematically raped despite, or perhaps because of their religious status, representing a particularly potent symbol of purity to be defiled. At the Catholic convent of St. Elizabeth in Mitte, Survivors recounted how the sisters were lined up and selected by age, with the younger ones separated for continued abuse over 3 days. A tragic phenomenon was that of the forced volunteers. When large groups of women were found, soldiers would sometimes demand that volunteers come forward to meet their demands. The terrible logic was that if some sacrificed themselves, the others would be spared, though this promise was rarely kept. This mechanism created heartbreaking moral dilemmas and fostered feelings of guilt that would persist for decades. Mothers volunteered to protect their daughters, older sisters to save the younger. Journalist Ursula von Kardorff, who secretly documented these events, wrote, "We had an agreement among 5 women in our building. When we heard them coming, one of us would go out to prevent them from searching for the rest. We took turns. I went twice. Afterwards, I couldn't look at myself in the mirror, not because of what they did to me, but because of what I became, a woman who walks willingly toward her own rape. But what choice did we have?" The hunts sometimes took on a ritual character for the perpetrators. Entire units organized safaris, where soldiers competed to capture the most women. Victims were marked with chalk or paint to indicate they had already been used. During these events, alcohol flowed freely, and officers often participated or supervised, turning sexual predation into a team-building activity. A frequently ignored aspect, the collective and public nature of many assaults. Unlike sexual violence in peacetime, often hidden, rapes in Berlin were frequently public acts, carried out in front of witnesses, including other soldiers, the victim's family, or civilians. This performative dimension amplified the humiliation and reinforced the message of total domination. It wasn't just the victim who was violated, but also her privacy, dignity, and social standing. Mortality rates among victims were extremely high. Some women died from direct injuries, internal bleeding, cranial trauma, strangulation. Others succumbed to infections, as wounds rarely received proper medical care. Many died weeks later from complications related to improvised abortions. Historians estimate that between 8,000 and 15,000 women died as a direct result of sexual violence in Berlin during the first weeks of occupation. An additional dimension of this tragedy was the response of the male civilian population. With most young German men dead, imprisoned, or in hiding, women were left virtually unprotected. The few men present faced an impossible dilemma. Intervening meant certain death, not intervening meant guilt for failing to protect their families. Many chose family suicide as a last form of escape. In Wannsee, a doctor and his wife poisoned their 3 teenage daughters and then took their own lives, leaving a note explaining they preferred to die together rather than see the girls dishonored by the Asians. Similar cases multiplied, with entire families choosing death over humiliation and ongoing terror. Hospitals of horror, when medicine became a witness to crime. When combat ceased in Berlin, the healthcare system lay as devastated as the buildings. Of the 60 pre-war hospitals, barely 10 remained partially operational. Bombed-out buildings, a critical shortage of medicine, lack of staff, and absence of basic services turned medical care into an almost impossible challenge. Berlin's hospitals became the front line of a new battle, the struggle to heal bodies and minds destroyed by systematic sexual violence. Charité Hospital, traditionally Berlin's most important medical center, attempted to organize a coordinated response. Under the direction of Dr. Ferdinand Sauerbruch, specific areas were designated for treating victims of sexual assault. Recovered medical records offer a disturbing window into the magnitude of the tragedy. During the first 3 weeks of May 1945, the hospital recorded over 3,700 women treated for trauma related to sexual assault, approximately 60% of all civilian admissions. The diagnoses repeated with terrifying similarity: vaginal and rectal tears, pelvic trauma, internal hemorrhaging, fractures from extreme violence, concussions. Dr. Walter Stoeckel, head of the gynecology department, wrote, "We are facing an unprecedented phenomenon. The injuries we observe daily surpass in severity and number anything previously documented. We are not treating isolated cases of sexual assault, but the consequences of industrialized sexual violence." The medical infrastructure was completely overwhelmed. Surgeons operated under medieval conditions, without adequate anesthesia, using instruments sterilized in alcohol when available. or simply washed with boiling water. Operating rooms functioned by candlelight during power outages. Medical staff worked 18 to 20-hour shifts, collapsing exhausted onto improvised cots between surgeries. Basic supplies were scarce, bandages were washed and reused until they fell apart. Antibiotics were reserved for cases of advanced sepsis. Transfusions were performed directly from donor to patient. Iodine was increasingly diluted, reducing its effectiveness. When morphine ran out, doctors resorted to alcohol as the only analgesic. Human resources were also limited. Many German doctors had fled, fearing retribution for Nazi affiliations. Others had been forcibly conscripted to the front. Those who remained were mostly elderly, ungraduated students, or Jewish doctors who had survived in hiding and emerged to help, such as Dr. Lily Jahn, a survivor of Ravensbrück. One of the most valuable testimonies comes from Dr. Anna-Marie Durand-Weber, an anti-Nazi gynecologist. In her diary, she described, "These are not ordinary patients. They arrive in deep shock, unable to speak or cry. Many won't say their names, identifying only as another one. Some show injuries I have never seen in my 25 years of practice. It's not just physical damage, something inside them is broken, something that may never be repaired." Dr. Durand-Weber documented cases that illustrate the extreme brutality. 13-year-old girls with tears requiring complex reconstructive surgeries, elderly women with massive bruising and fractures, pregnant women with traumatic miscarriages. The case that affected her most was that of a 19-year-old girl brought in unconscious, raped by at least 25 soldiers consecutively, and left abandoned in the street. Despite medical efforts, she died from hypovolemic shock during surgery. Eventually, Soviet doctors began collaborating in treating victims, contributing supplies and personnel. This aid, though valuable, created emotionally complex situations. Many patients refused treatment from Soviet doctors, fearing further abuse. On the other hand, some Soviet doctors showed genuine compassion and remorse, working tirelessly to repair the damage caused by their compatriots. A massive medical issue was the spread of sexually transmitted diseases. Within weeks, Berlin doctors faced an unprecedented epidemic of syphilis and gonorrhea. The shortage of penicillin, which was only beginning to become available for civilian use, meant that many infections could not be properly treated. Medical personnel improvised with older, less effective treatments such as arsenic and mercury compounds, which had variable results and severe side effects. Dr. Charlotte Pommer, a specialist in venereal diseases, estimated that approximately 60% of assaulted women contracted an infection. For many, these infections led to chronic complications: pelvic inflammation, infertility, reactive arthritis, and long-term health issues that would affect them for decades. Unwanted pregnancy became another massive health crisis. Tens of thousands of German women became pregnant as a result of rapes during the Soviet occupation. Medical authorities established an unofficial system to facilitate abortions. Although technically illegal under then-current German law, paragraph 218 of the Penal Code, this practice was tolerated as an exceptional humanitarian necessity. Special medical commissions were created to approve terminations for women who certified having been assaulted by foreign soldiers. These abortions were carried out under precarious conditions, often without anesthesia. Complications were common: hemorrhages, infections, uterine perforations. For some women, the procedure was fatal. For many others, it represented the only option when faced with the prospect of bearing a child conceived through a traumatic experience. A nurse at Moabit Hospital recorded, "The women come in desperate, begging us to take it out. They don't speak of pregnancies or fetuses. They say, 'the Russian thing inside me,' or simply 'it.'" Women who chose to continue with their pregnancies, whether due to religious conviction, fear of medical procedures, or discovering their condition too late, faced another kind of trauma. Many gave birth in isolation, rejected by their families or communities. Their children, often identifiable by distinct physical features, were stigmatized as Russenkinder, Russian children, or Besatzungskinder, occupation children. This generation grew up marked by social rejection, discrimination in schools, and silence about their origins. The psychological impact of mass assaults was perhaps the most lasting and least addressed aspect of the trauma. In 1945, The concept of mental health in wartime situations was only beginning to be considered. Pioneering work on war neurosis from the First World War had laid some foundations, but there were no specific protocols to treat what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, especially in cases of mass sexual violence. Victims were left to their own psychological resources without specialized support. The few psychiatrists available in Berlin were overwhelmed with cases of war neurosis in returning soldiers and could offer only superficial attention to civilian victims. Additionally, many mental health professionals had been compromised by collaboration with Nazi eugenics policies, further complicating the situation. The psychological reactions of victims followed recognizable patterns. Many developed severe symptoms: chronic insomnia, recurring nightmares, reliving the assaults, dissociative states of emotional detachment, self-harming behaviors, and specific phobias: fear of enclosed spaces, darkness, men in uniform. Suicide became a frequent escape. Records document a dramatic increase in female suicides during the summer of 1945. In Steglitz alone, more than 40 women took their own lives in June, many leaving notes referencing the assaults they had endured. The most common method was overdose of sleeping pills, followed by gas poisoning and hanging. Some chose public suicides, in front of Soviet police stations or in squares, as a final act of protest. A devastating phenomenon was self-imposed silence. Most survivors never spoke of what had happened. Social stigma, shame, fear of rejection, and the absence of a cultural framework to process this trauma led many women to bury their experiences. This silence had transgenerational consequences. It affected how these women related to their bodies, their partners, their children. One patient told Dr. Durand-Weber, "I'll never tell anyone. If I ever marry, my husband will never know. I'll carry this with me to the grave." Some survivors developed what doctors called insensitivity syndrome, a kind of permanent dissociation where the woman appeared to function normally in practical aspects, but had lost the ability to feel or express deep emotions. A nurse described these patients as women who walk and talk, but whose eyes are empty, as if their true self had been left behind in May of 1945. For doctors and healthcare staff, constant exposure to this level of suffering also generated secondary trauma. Many developed extreme exhaustion, alcoholism, or severe depression. Others experienced crises of professional faith. Dr. Kata Leichter wrote, "I ask myself daily if we are truly helping. We heal bodies, but what about their souls? We return repaired women to a world that has destroyed them. Is this medicine, or just a more sophisticated form of torture?" Some, like Dr. Durand-Weber, channeled their anguish into activism, later founding organizations dedicated to reproductive health and women's rights. In 1947, she established one of the first family planning counseling centers in West Germany, offering not only medical services, but also a space where women could speak about their experiences. As Berlin entered a phase of physical reconstruction, the invisible wounds remained unaddressed. Hospitals gradually regained operational capacity, medical supplies began to flow regularly, and acute physical emergencies diminished. However, the psychological aftermath was only beginning to surface, shaping a legacy of trauma that would persist in silence for generations. Survival or humiliation, when the body became the final currency. When the fighting ended, the city was not only physically destroyed, the social and economic fabric had completely disintegrated. Berliners faced a daily struggle for basic survival in conditions that resembled the Middle Ages more than the 20th century. Reich currency was worthless. Official rations barely reached 800 to 900 calories per day, far below the 2,000 required for basic bodily functions. There was no electricity in most districts, sewage systems had collapsed, and gas was practically non-existent. Water had to be collected from manual pumps, often contaminated. The winter of 1945 to 46 was approaching, and the civilian population, mainly women, the elderly, and children, faced hunger and freezing temperatures. In this context, a parallel economy based on barter emerged. Cigarettes became the unofficial currency. A single cigarette could be exchanged for a small loaf of bread. 5 cigarettes paid for a doctor's services. A full pack was worth as much as a winter coat. Coffee, chocolate, and soap also served as alternative currencies. Occupation soldiers had privileged access to these valuable goods. Their rations included cigarettes, chocolate, coffee, canned food, gasoline, and medicine, items unattainable for the German population. A Soviet or American soldier could earn in one day, through his cigarette ration, the equivalent of a German professional's monthly salary. For thousands of German women, the choice came down to brutally simple terms: exchange sexual relations for survival. This phenomenon, which began as a direct extension of the initial rapes, evolved into a more organized but equally coercive system. It was not a free choice, nor can it be classified as traditional prostitution. It was a desperate response to extreme circumstances, where the alternative was starvation or watching one's dependents die of hunger. For some women, it meant seeking the protection of an officer who would provide food and shelter in exchange for sexual exclusivity. These relationships, though forced by circumstances, could offer a certain degree of protection against multiple assaults. As one survivor explained, "You became the property of one to avoid being the property of 20. It was a cage, but at least a cage with food and without constant beatings." These relationships followed an identifiable pattern. They began as rapes, but the perpetrator might develop a certain interest in his victim and decide to claim her as exclusive property. This meant preventing other soldiers from assaulting her, providing food, and occasionally giving gifts like stockings, chocolate, or hygiene items. In return, the woman had to be sexually available and sometimes perform domestic tasks. These arrangements could last days, weeks, or months, ending abruptly when the soldier was transferred or lost interest. Eyewitness accounts describe various unofficial categories in this improvised sexual economy. Bataillonsbraut, battalion brides, were young women associated with entire military units, receiving food and protection in exchange for sexual services to multiple soldiers. They lived in barracks or requisitioned buildings nearby, available according to schedules set by non-commissioned officers. Though formally voluntary, their condition was one of enslavement, as attempting to escape meant losing protection and facing retaliation. In contrast, Freundinnen, girlfriends, established more personalized relationships with a single soldier, usually of higher rank. These relationships sometimes developed into emotionally complex bonds, with soldiers occasionally displaying genuine affection or even promising marriage or evacuation, promises rarely fulfilled due to military prohibitions on fraternization. A third category, Handlerinnen, independent traders, operated with more autonomy, exchanging brief encounters for specific goods: chocolate, stockings, kerosene. These transactions occurred in improvised settings: bombed-out buildings, military vehicles, public parks. Desperation had normalized the unthinkable, with sexual acts taking place in plain sight in ruins that had once been respectable middle-class apartments. Magda Wieland, a 24-year-old actress, left a revealing testimony. After being discovered in a wardrobe during the first days of the occupation, she was raped by a soldier from Central Asia. To avoid further assaults, she proposed becoming his exclusive girlfriend. The arrangement worked briefly until the soldier bragged about his conquest to comrades, who then sought her out as shared prey. Her story illustrates the fragility of these arrangements and the constant vulnerability of women, even those who tried to negotiate a measure of protection. A disturbing aspect was the role of some German men in this sexual economy. With most young adults dead or imprisoned, the few remaining German civilians, typically elderly, teenagers, or those with privileged connections, sometimes acted as intermediaries. Some fathers or husbands, powerless in the face of starvation, went so far as to offer their daughters or wives to soldiers in exchange for food or fuel. Conventional morality had collapsed under the weight of basic survival. Equally troubling was the emergence of improvised pimps who organized networks of desperate women, negotiating with Soviet officers for supplies in exchange for access to multiple women. They justified their actions as a way to rationalize the inevitable, arguing they provided some structure and protection. In reality, they exploited both the women and the soldiers, keeping most of the supplies for themselves. The occupiers themselves established informal systems of exploitation, Some Soviet officers rented out their German girlfriends to other soldiers in exchange for goods or favors. In certain areas, especially near military bases, improvised brothels emerged where desperate women served dozens of soldiers daily in exchange for military rations. These operations, though not officially sanctioned, were tolerated by mid-level commanders who viewed them as a way to keep their troops content and reduce incidents of random rapes. With the division of Berlin into occupation sectors in July 1945, the dynamic shifted but did not disappear. In British and American zones, prostitution assumed more organized and less violent forms, but remained economically coercive. Semi-official establishments emerged where women received payments in dollars or pounds and access to goods unavailable to the general population. For Western authorities, these establishments represented a necessary evil that limited the spread of venereal diseases and reduced uncontrolled fraternization. One notable aspect was the difference in treatment depending on the occupation sector. In the Soviet sector, conditions generally remained brutal, with a high prevalence of direct and violent exploitation. In contrast, the Western sectors offered less overtly violent but equally exploitative conditions, based on extreme economic coercion. As one survivor observed, "With the Russians, they raped you and then maybe gave you food. With the Americans, you starved first, then came begging." The situation grew more complex with women who regularly crossed between sectors, nicknamed Grenzgängerinnen, border crossers. These women adapted their behavior and appearance according to the sector. In the Soviet zone, they dressed modestly and feigned submission. In the American zone, they adopted a more westernized style, using makeup and flashy clothing when they could obtain it. They developed an astonishing sense of adaptation, learning key phrases in multiple languages and the specific cultural codes of each nationality. Material conditions were often horrifying. Many worked in bombed-out buildings with no heating or sanitation. In winter, sub-zero temperatures turned these spaces into freezing chambers where they developed severe frostbite and frequent pneumonia. The lack of running water made basic hygiene impossible, contributing to high infection rates. Medical services, when available, consisted of humiliating inspections, focused more on detecting venereal diseases than on general well-being. To protect themselves from the cold and prying eyes, they developed specific dress codes. They wrapped themselves in layers of old clothing that could be quickly removed and replaced between clients. Scarves or hoods partially concealed their faces, not only to avoid social stigma, but also to remain unrecognizable to relatives or former neighbors. This deliberately anonymous appearance reflected a desperate attempt to preserve some vestige of identity apart from their situation. The health consequences were devastating. Sexually transmitted diseases spread rapidly, with infection rates exceeding 60% among women engaged in sexual exchanges for survival. Syphilis and gonorrhea were particularly prevalent, but cases of chancroid, lymphogranuloma venereum, and other less common infections were also documented. Resistant strains developed over years of irregular treatment on the front lines were especially difficult to treat with the limited medical resources available. Unwanted pregnancies were frequent, leading to unsafe abortions or abandonment of newborns. Hospitals reported a sharp increase in abandoned infants during 1946, many with visibly mixed racial features. At Neukölln Hospital, the maternity ward reported that over 60% of births between June and December of 1945 were to single mothers, and approximately one-third of these babies were either surrendered to hospital custody or abandoned shortly after birth. Over time, structures of sexual exploitation evolved and became institutionalized. As Berlin transitioned from immediate occupation to a more stable foreign military presence, recognized districts emerged where prostitution was tolerated or even informally regulated. In areas like Potsdamer Platz, Alexanderplatz, and zones near train stations, bars, clubs, and hotels sprang up that functioned primarily as spaces for sexual commerce, under the tolerant gaze of authorities who preferred to keep such activities confined to specific zones. Most heartbreaking was the social transformation of these women. From victims, they became stigmatized as collaborators or prostitutes. German society, unable to process its collective trauma, projected its shame and guilt onto them. They were excluded from their communities, rejected by their families, shamed in public. Even those initially raped and later forced into prostitution for survival bore the double stigma of being both impure and traitorous. Hildegard Knef, who later became an actress, described this process. First, we were victims of the Russians. Then we were victims of hunger. Finally, we became victims of our own neighbors, who looked at us as if we were trash. No one asked why we did what we did. No one asked what they would have done in our place. It was easier to point fingers and condemn than to admit we were all equally desperate. This stigma extended to children born of these circumstances. Women who had children with occupation soldiers faced cruel rejection. Their children were derisively called Russenkinder, Army babies, or Besatzungskinder, depending on the father's nationality. In schools and public spaces, these children faced constant discrimination, from cruel taunts to systematic exclusion. Many mothers chose to send these children to orphanages or give them up for adoption, unable to protect them from social hatred or support them financially. Others tried to hide their children's origins, inventing stories about missing or deceased German fathers. Some moved to different cities where no one knew their past, starting new lives based on necessary lies for self-protection. This situation posed devastating moral dilemmas. Many developed genuine love for their children despite the circumstances of their conception, but knew that keeping them meant condemning them to a life of stigma. A woman from Kreuzberg wrote, "I love my son, but every time I look at him I also see the man who raped me, and every time others look at him they see the enemy. How can I protect him? Sometimes I think that to love him is to let him go." When the economic situation began to stabilize gradually from 1947 to 48, especially after the currency reform in the Western zones, many women were able to leave survival prostitution. However, after years under these conditions, many lacked up-to-date job skills, formal education, or social connections to fully reintegrate. Some remained in the sex trade as their only viable option, though under less desperate circumstances. Others found marginal work in factories, cleaning services, or as domestic workers, often keeping their past a closely guarded secret. Faceless crimes, the invisible traces of Berlin's horror. After the withdrawal of the Red Army and the institutionalization of power in Berlin, reconstruction began. The Trümmerfrauen cleared the rubble. Basic services were restored, transportation resumed, and schools reopened. The currency reform in the West and planned economy in the East allowed for economic stabilization. By 1950, Berlin showed visible signs of recovery. In parallel, invisible effects persisted. Tens of thousands of women affected by rape and forced prostitution during the Soviet occupation. These experiences were neither publicly addressed nor institutionally recognized. The psychological trauma received no medical or social attention. In the German Democratic Republic, GDR, the issue was silenced by the state apparatus. Acknowledging these facts would have contradicted the official image of the Red Army as a liberating force. Archives were destroyed, documents classified, and publication of testimonies was prevented. Researchers were persecuted, and those who tried to address the issue faced surveillance, censorship, or professional consequences. In the Federal Republic of Germany, FRG, the silence was driven by diplomatic interests during the Cold War. Authorities avoided additional tensions with the USSR. The general population also refrained from addressing the issue, partly due to a tendency to suppress traumatic memories of the recent past. Some churches offered refuge and medical assistance, but simultaneously reinforced social stigmas against the victims. In some cases, women with children by Soviet soldiers were excluded from religious communities or pressured to give up their children. Some institutions allowed entry only under specific conditions. Many affected women developed symptoms now associated with post-traumatic stress disorder: insomnia, flashbacks, hypervigilance, emotional dissociation, inability to maintain stable emotional relationships. These symptoms were neither diagnosed nor treated at the time. There was no clinical framework to understand these reactions. Later studies conducted in the 1970s and 80s identified patterns of persistent psychological trauma. Some women compartmentalized their experiences mentally, while others reported sensory triggers that provoked intense reactions decades after the events. In some cases, episodes of partial memory loss or selective mutism were recorded. The trauma's impact extended to their children. Many grew up in environments marked by hypervigilance, anxiety, distrust of the outside world, and emotional communication voids. Daughters were raised with strict social constraints, while sons received contradictory messages about male roles. Resulting family dynamics showed closed structures and little interaction with the external environment. So-called children of the occupation grew up with altered or fragmented versions of their origins. Some were adopted, others grew up with hidden identities. From the 1980s onward, many attempted to reconstruct their personal histories, encountering obstacles such as sealed records, lost documents, and incomplete testimonies. Support organizations were created, though results were limited due to the lack of official information. In several cases, it was discovered that hospital records, birth certificates, and parish archives had been modified or erased. Some mothers refused to speak even in the later stages of life. Requests for access to documentation in Soviet military archives received no response. In some cases, genetic testing was used to attempt to establish parentage. Later, transgenerational studies identified psychological effects even in the third generation, manifesting as chronic anxiety, sleep disorders, and emotional attachment difficulties. These patterns were identified as part of a non-verbal transmission of trauma, with hypotheses including familial, behavioral, or even epigenetic mechanisms. Recent research in clinical psychology has explored the link between extreme maternal stress and changes in genetic expression in their descendants. The mass rapes during the occupation were neither prosecuted nor legally recognized as war crimes. No charges related to sexual violence were included in the Nuremberg trials. No reparations were offered, nor were there legal proceedings connected to these acts. For decades, the official Soviet position was to deny or minimize them. The affected women received neither compensation nor formal acknowledgement from any government. After German reunification in 1990, research based on previously inaccessible archives began to emerge. The book A Woman in Berlin, first published in English in 1954, was initially met with rejection in Germany. It was only republished in German in 2003 and received widespread public attention. Its publication spurred a new wave of academic and media investigation. The detailed chronological testimony served as a primary reference for future collections of survivor accounts. Researchers such as Barbara Ure, Helke Sander, and Atina Grossman collected testimonies from survivors. It was estimated that between 100,000 and 130,000 women were raped in Berlin, and over 2 million across all of Germany. These figures indicated that the assaults were not isolated incidents, but a widespread practice. Several reports noted a concentration of cases in the first weeks of occupation, though episodes continued for months. From these investigations emerged cultural representations and documentaries that reached the general public. At the same time, a few commemorative plaques were placed and remembrance ceremonies were held. These acts occurred decades after the events, when most victims had already passed away. Some municipal institutions included specific references in local museums and historical archives. Systematic sexual violence during armed conflicts was formally recognized as a war crime with the 1998 Rome Statute, which established the International Criminal Court. This legislation did not exist in 1945, and its retroactive application poses legal challenges. Individual claims based on human rights were dismissed due to the lack of international jurisdiction at the time of the events. Some groups have proposed formal recognition by the Russian state as the successor to the Soviet Union, or at least full access to the related military archives. Others prioritize comprehensive historical documentation and the creation of memorial spaces. In some academic forums, international conferences focused exclusively on sexual violence in the context of World War II have been proposed. The inclusion of these events in the official narrative of World War II has been partial and delayed. The traditional focus on military operations and political decisions has relegated civilian experience, especially that of women, to a secondary position in historical discourse. Some universities have incorporated these studies into programs on memory, gender, and armed conflict. The affected women continued their lives after the war, raised children, and contributed to national reconstruction. Their experiences, however, remained on the margins of public history for more than half a century. Access to their testimonies was limited by multiple factors: state censorship, social stigma, psychological barriers, and lack of institutional interest.